Hey everybody, so as we start chapter 12, what we're going to be looking at here is America on the home front, and we're going to be looking at the different kinds of sacrifices Americans are asked to make during World War II. And we want to start this conversation by talking about a special kind of sacrifice that many Americans had to consider as they were looking to fight in World War II, and that is whether or not, if you were an ethnic minority, you should make the sacrifice potentially of your life, of your family, of your friends, in order to fight for your country. I mean, think about it. Why would an ethnic minority who is mistreated at home want to fight for a country that mistreats them? Right? Think about it, right? There's still in America with Jim Crow laws and lynching and segregation and unfair pay, all these kinds of sexism and racism and prejudice that's out there. So let's give you some examples of the kinds of things that ethnic minorities and other kinds of minorities in America had to consider. So for example, we'll start with African Americans. We organized African Americans into segregated units with whites leading them. And many African Americans found that insulting that they were still serving in a secondary role in the military. But African Americans began to push for what they called the double V, and I'll circle it right up there for you, the double V. And that meant V for victory, a victory over Hitler's racism in Europe, and a victory over racism here at home. And I think this quote, which is right up here, I'll put a box around it. I think this quote really summarizes it well. The Army Jim Crows us. Employers, labor unions, shut us out. Lynchings continue. We're disenfranchised. We can't vote. We're spat on. What else could Hitler do? Kill us? That could happen here at home anyway. So we see African Americans looking at the reality of the situation and saying, this is another chance for us to prove ourselves to the rest of America. FDR even has to order that African Americans be put into combat because white officers don't want to use them in combat situations. A fantastic example would be this group of airmen right here. This is the Tuskegee Airmen. I'll blow that up for you. This is some of them anyway. There's lots of Tuskegee Airmen. These are some of them. And the Tuskegee Airmen have an unbelievable combat record. They were some of the best pilots in all of World War II, but whites didn't want to serve with them until they realized exactly how good the Tuskegee Airmen really were. 32 pilots downed and captured as prisoners of war. Any bomber that flew with the Tuskegee Airmen was safed. The Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber. Tons of medals earned. You can see them listed all there for you. Purple Hearts, bronze medals, air medals, distinguished flying crosses. They flew over 15,000 missions, destroying hundreds of planes and rail cars and trucks, a destroyer, dozens of pilots being killed in action. This is exactly what the Double V was about. It was about African Americans saying, you may not treat us well here at home, but we're going to prove to you that you should. Other groups that had to face similar kinds of realities would be Japanese Americans who were serving in our armed forces, who had to prove themselves because don't forget, it was Japan that bombed Pearl Harbor, and many Americans did not like or trust Japanese Americans. In fact, half of them served in something we'll take a look at here in a minute called an internment camp. But the reality of their service is they too were out to prove themselves. Two of their units, the 100th Infantry and 442nd Combat Team, they were the most decorated units in the history of the United States military. Even women who don't receive fair pay and aren't allowed to have certain jobs are enlisted in the military for the first time in the Women's Army Corps. So what we see here is really ethnic minorities and other minorities willing to sacrifice everything to show that they deserve better here at home in America. And that success, the success of the Tuskegee Airmen and other units like them, allowed President Truman, after the war was over, 1948, the argument that he should fully integrate the military and get rid of segregation. So that sacrifice paid off, at least as far as the military was concerned. Let's take a look at another kind of sacrifice that's being made here, and that's going to be a sacrifice that talks about the economy. And move my head up out of the way here. All right. Because really, daily life in America, at least as we know it, isn't going to be the same. Because while World War II will put an end to the Great Depression, our economy isn't geared for a world war. We have to figure out a way to change everything in our lives and how we work in order to get this economy going. So we come up with an idea, and we call it the cost-plus system. And it says that if you work really fast and produce a lot, you'll make a ton of money. It sped up war production by giving larger profits to companies that could work fast. Here's how it works. The government guarantees to pay you for whatever the cost is for anything you produce. You don't have to pay for it. The government will cover the cost. And it will give you a small profit. So the more you make and the faster you make it, the more profit you'll make. You're guaranteed to make profit, and you're guaranteed to have no costs. You're going to see a ton of companies want to get in on this because it's guaranteed money with no costs. They're going to apply to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, I just highlighted it for you, to change their factories to war production, and they get loans from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to do that. Great example of this would be Henry Ford, who converts many of his factories over to producing war materials, one of which was this gigantic bomber that's right up here. That's the B-24 Liberator bomber. And the Ford factory is able to produce hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these bombers incredibly quickly. Another example would be the ships that we have that we use to transport supplies and materials and men to Europe. Because German submarines had been sinking a ton of our ships, so we had to find a new, faster way to build ships. So we build these things called Liberty ships. And what we do is, instead of having everything shipped to the coast of America, assembling it and building it there, we build parts of ships all over America and send them already completed to the coast. So all you have to do is when the parts get there, you put it together, and boom, ship is done. And you can get another one in there. It's so fast, we can go from 244 days for a ship to just 41 to make a ship. So we really start to see ways for us to kind of make our economy faster, stronger, better. We put women to work in factories by the millions. Rosie the Riveter, this woman over here, I'll kind of blow up this image of her. There she is. There's Rosie the Riveter. She becomes a symbol of the campaign to hire a woman to work in these factories because these women are needed. 2.5 million women are working in factories in war production. And that's a really big deal because it changes the way America considers and the roles Americans consider as efficient and useful for their women. And even when it comes to race, FDR wants to be sure that we can get anyone who's capable of working, white, black, Hispanic, whatever it might be, into these factories in order to produce war materials. So he creates the Fair Employment Practices Commission to end discrimination in hiring workers in defense industries. So all of these things kind of really begin to change our economy, and it's a sacrifice that Americans have to make in terms of what's made and how it's made and those kinds of topics. And the evidence is right here, right? Look how much we make, right? You see how fast it goes up. We'll take a look at this chart a little bit more in class. I think another good sacrifice that we should be talking about here that Americans have to put up with is daily life, because everything will change. For example, every American will receive one of these books. It's called a war ration book, and the Office of Price Administration, and you can even see that on the book right there, begins rationing, and everyone gets one of these books, and in these books are a bunch of stamps that look like the ones that I've just blown up for you. And you use these stamps to buy products. Everything you need, you use a stamp to buy. Now, why would we do that? Why would we need to use a stamp to buy a product? when we could just go to the store and get it. Because we want to ration or limit the availability of these consumer goods so we have enough for the military, so they have enough socks, coffee, butter, meat, salt, everything that they need to survive, gasoline. To compensate, Americans will plant gardens, and we'll see Americans planting victory gardens to provide themselves for food. We'll see more and more Americans give up life in the country to move to urban areas to increase production. We'll see a lot of people move to the South in California during World War II in order to work in new factories that are growing up. We actually call this region the Sun Belt today. You can see it here in this map. A lot of Americans move to the Sun Belt to work in these factories. We see people buy war bonds to help pay the war effort, right? Americans bought over $150 billion worth of bonds, lending the government that money, getting it back in interest to pay for the war. And that's a financial sacrifice that we have to make. That's less money we have day to day. And even our entertainment has changed. For example, the Office of War Information is created, and we'll show you an example of some of these in class, where they're going to try and help us better understand the war effort so that we know what's going on, so that we support the war effort, changing what we see on TV, what we see in the movies. So there's daily life in wartime that changes. And I think there's one other real big change that we need to talk about too, and that's an issue of civil rights. Because a number of Americans will be sacrificing their civil rights during World War II. And I'll give you some examples. Obviously, we are at war with Japan, thanks to their bombing of Pearl Harbor. And FDR says that we have to be ready for an invasion. And so he declares and says that any part of the United States can be called a military zone. And what that means is that when you declare any part of the United States a military zone, Japanese Americans can be moved out of that zone out of fear they are spies. So what you'll see will be posters like this one go up all across America that says, notice to people of Japanese ancestry in the following areas, you need to pack up, get yourself together, and then you need to get out. You need to get out of the area, and you're going to be heading to an internment camp. 10 different internment camps were built around the United States. Now, these are better names than concentration camps or prisons, right? We call it an internment camp because they hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, never was anyone convicted of spying that was put into an internment camp. Never any evidence found of the 110,000 citizens that were relocated into these internment camps in the middle of nowhere. No one was ever proved a spy. And these camps were not nice places, folks. They were cold, you didn't have winter clothing, some places didn't get blankets, they didn't have good schooling, they didn't have good jobs, and everything that you owned had to be given up before you left. There was no guarantee that you would come back to, for example, your store, like this grocery store, which would have to be sold before you were sent off to an internment camp. Or this one that says closing out, evacuation sale. You had only weeks to get rid of all of your belongings and possessions, which meant that you never got fair value for them. Imagine if you had to sell your house in 2 weeks and you had no one there that was buying. You had to sell it. And when you came back from the internment camp, you didn't get it back. You had to start over from scratch. And lots of people were prejudiced, right? Japs, don't let the sun set on you here, keep moving. Right? There were people that were definitely prejudiced. You can understand why Japanese Americans would sue. That goes to the Supreme Court. They rule in a court case called Korematsu versus the United States that in time of an emergency, a government can suspend your rights. And it takes decades, but the government will apologize in 1988 to formerly intern Japanese Americans. And he says, our bad, we probably shouldn't have done that. Here's $20,000. Thank you for your patience. And even others like Germans and Americans are arrested and sent to internment camps as well. So lots of sacrifices being made, and we'll talk more about this in class.